Is it beneficial to watch films of your target language with English subtitles? Well, I would have said no, like a long time ago. Well, until quite recently. But I've recently changed my mind about this, and I'm just going to talk about it quickly because I think why it's good to do this, why it's good to watch foreign films in English subtitles, is sort of indicative. It sort of represents so much of like how I think people should learn languages. Because I think the basic thing of language learning that basically everyone forgets is it has to be enjoyable, has to be engaging, but it also has to be it has to be easy enough for it to be enjoyable and engaging. And this is the thing that people forget. It's funny, I think language learning at its absolute best, where it's most sort of effective where your brain sort of understands it at its best, is not when you're grafting at it, you know. Now, you can learn a language by grafting, you know, people do. But often when they do, they have kind of a reason why they want to learn that language, you know. Like, they're living in the country where it's spoken. Obviously that gives you a tremendous advantage as well. Or, you know, they're married to someone or they're going out with someone who speaks that language, you know. So there's kind of some big reason for it. But I think a lot of language learners, they just want to learn a language. Maybe they like the culture a bit. Maybe there's some kind of reason usually behind it. You know, they visited the country in the past or whatever. But fundamentally, they just kind of think it's interesting. You know, when I talk to most people about like languages they want to learn, it tends to be they say something like, "Well, I just think it's cool. You know, I like the culture." It's something like that. It's not, I've got a relative who speaks it, or I'm gonna move there at some point. So anyway, my point is that, you know, for the vast majority of people, language learning, it starts from this kind of place of wonder and curiosity, rather than this kind of necessity to learn it. And if that's the case, language learning is going to happen in a very different way. And I think in the best way, because it's not going to be about putting pressure on yourself to learn it. If you want to learn a language to the highest capacity, what you're going to have to do is engage with it in a way that fills you with wonder and curiosity, and keep that going for as long as possible. And if all this sounds a bit kind of esoteric and a bit fluffy, just stay with me here, because it's all going to come together. You know, I do have a wider point here that I'm trying to make. So I think when you start off in a language, you have that curiosity already, because you've never studied it before, and this is a new opportunity to study it. And I have this at the moment with Russian. You know, I could read just about anything in Russian right now, or certainly like when I started learning it. Maybe it's a bit different now, but you know, when I started learning Russian, I could read anything in Russian, and I'll just find it absolutely fascinating, because the language itself is new to me. You know, I'm not so interested in the content. I'm more interested in just the letters and the sounds that the letters make, and then the words, you know, and that is enough, you know. And I could honestly, I could just read anything in Russian and just be fascinated by it. You know, I could read like the back of a soap bottle that has, you know, applies to the hands, or you know, that has the instructions in Russian, and I found that so engaging. You know, a lot of people start off with this where it's just really engaging to learn the language because it's new, because it's exciting, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. It's a bit like when you start going out with someone, just everything is very easy because you've just started going out with them, and everything they do is just really captivating and exciting, and you don't really have to work to keep the fun alive. It's already there. But over time, and I see this happening myself with Russian quite quickly, is the language starts to become familiar. And that's because your brain's made those sort of connections where it's not so sort of, doesn't give you the same high that it used to. I mean, I look at Russian writing now and it's a beautiful alphabet and everything, but I can tell I'm slightly more familiar with it now. It doesn't quite give me the same sort of kick, if you like, that it used to. Same when I studied Italian. When I first studied Italian, every word I learned, I was like, wow, what a beautiful word that is, or the spelling system I just thought was so exciting and interesting. Meanwhile now, it just kind of makes sense to me, because I've spent so much time learning it. And you can go away and then come back to it and regain that same kind of excitement about it. But if you want to progress in a language and get a bit more out of it than just like, oh, cool, just the cool experience of learning it, you have to start engaging with something more than just the kind of the words and the kind of the sort of wonder of the vocabulary itself, because after a while you're just going to get used to it, you're going to get bored of it, and it's not going to be enough. Like I say, when I started learning Russian, I would just consume any content in the language. I'd just sit there and just write down like anything that came up. Like I'd watch those kind of easy Russian videos on YouTube. It didn't matter. It doesn't matter what they were talking about, how boring it was. I was just excited to be learning some Russian and hearing it and writing it down. I could go straight into a kind of flow activity doing that. But now I can see myself. I'm at a stage where that's not enough for me, because that appeal, that sort of start-off appeal, started to loosen. And this is the point where you basically have to start consuming content that is really interesting for its own sake. And you have to sort of make the leap from just being interested in the language itself to being interested in kind of the culture. And the thing is, the two do go hand in hand, in the big picture. But at this stage in the game, you have to kind of see them as slightly separate things. And it's like, you almost have to get into the culture of the language that you're learning just in order that you kind of continue studying the language, to put it bluntly. And that might sound quite sad, that might sound quite dull. And you compare it to a relationship where a similar thing happens. You go out with someone, and to begin with it's very easy, but then you have to kind of start making time to keep that excitement going. Your lives get busy, things crop up, you kind of get used to each other, and you have to find ways to keep it exciting. It requires effort. And I think it's a very similar thing with languages. And in a sense, that's a bit kind of sad when you think of it like that. But the better way to think about it is that this is really where the journey kind of begins. And I think if you learn a language long enough, the sort of beauty that you get a revelation at the end when you really truly, there comes a certain point where that initial kind of spark that made you want to learn the language, that might have been as simple as just you liked how it looked written down on a page, or you liked how it sounded. You discover kind of a more profound truth. You sort of discover what's led you to study that kind of initial impetus in much greater detail. But to do that, you have to engage with the content and the culture, because otherwise it's just not enough. Just studying the language for the language's sake, it's not going to be enough. So you have to start engaging with stuff that is going to be easy, that you're interested in the target language. And the most obvious thing that you can go to, and there are obviously lots of things that you can go to, the most obvious thing you can go to is going to be some kind of content, film content. So TV shows, the news, films, those are kind of the big three. It's one of those, and of course YouTube videos as well. And it's very easy when you start. So you start having to consume this kind of content, and the trouble is, if you study it, if you're still quite new to the language, and you study it, it's very easy to just think, I have a basic grip of the language now. I'm just going to watch it in the target language with subtitles. So, for example, with me, I did this with Italian. I just watched a bunch of TV shows with Italian subtitles, and I've been thinking about doing the same in Russian. Like, I want to watch the film Bratz, and I was thinking about just watching it with Russian subtitles because, my grammar, my vocabulary is not amazing, but I know enough to kind of keep on with it. But here's the tricky thing. So despite the fact that, in a sense, that's much better because you have lots of contact with the language, you lose your ability, your sort of sense of wonder with the language because it's slightly too hard. And this is one thing that I thought with Italian, and I think that's slightly why I fell off towards the end, is even though, I had a good grip on the language, I could communicate, I could translate fairly well, when I put on a TV show, even though I had, Italian subtitles on, it was still a little bit too much of a struggle for me to understand what was being said. Even though I could make it out, half the time. And in retrospect, what I should have done is put it in English subtitles with Italian, Italian voice, whatever, because that would have kept my wonder in Italian. Now, it might not have been in the Italian language as such, but it would be in the broader picture of Italian culture and the Italian way of life, of which the language is part. And that's the thing that you want to cling on to when you're studying the language. Because it's all the same thing ultimately. And even though it compromises your sort of exposure to the language per se, because everything's in English, your sort of engagement in the culture, and therefore your sort of engagement in the language, will go through the roof. And your exposure to the language is not completely rejected because you still have the original, in Italian in the sound. You just got an English translation right in front of you, and this is good because that's kind of just the right amount of sort of depth for you to swim in, but not sink. I just think I picked up so much Russian just watching sort of Bold and Bankrupt's videos on YouTube. If you don't know him, he's sort of quite a well-known travel vlogger, gone around a lot of Russia, speaking Russian, and to locals he'll speak to them in Russian, and there'll be subtitles in English, and it's so funny because I just pick up phrases from that without any sort of active sort of effort. I just suddenly realise, I'm trying to think of an example. So I don't know. I remember there was one time where it wasn't him himself, but it was one of his friends said, "Mi сейчас drugi," and I thought, "Drugi," and the translation for that was "we are friends," and I thought, "Drugi," that must be like friends, because just common knowledge, drug means friend in Russian, and so I sort of subconsciously made that connection, and you think about how, when you ask someone foreign who speaks English, how do they say they learnt it? 9 times out of 10, they'll say it was from watching English TV shows. It wasn't from actively studying it. And, I'd be interested to know, but I bet they started watching them in subtitles, with subtitles in their own language. Because that provided, little did they know it, but that provided enough exposure for them to just passively start understanding the language. And eventually they probably just thought, I understand all of this anyway, I don't even need subtitles. And there you go. So yeah, but the thing I'm trying to get back to is you just want to keep, the more you study a language, the more sort of you get used to the intricacies and sort of what the language itself has to offer. And if you want to really break into that stage of being fluent in the language, I think you have to start finding a way to sort of get into the culture, because that's part of the wider mission of getting into the language. And for me myself, you have to sometimes swallow quite a lot of pride, because you can be at quite a high level in the language, in theory, but you still could benefit from doing this. You still could benefit from just watching it with English subtitles. And I think, when I revisit Italian in the future, that's probably what I'll do. Because I think it's the sort of best thing.